All right, 4.1, let's start video 2. And we're going to start with the nation of Portugal. Portugal is located right here. We see the Iberian Peninsula, southern Europe. There's Africa. There's France and the rest of Europe up here. Portugal right here. We can see they're right next to the Atlantic Ocean, a perfect spot for traveling out to try to get to new places, especially to the Americas. Portugal becomes the first European to embark on a program of exploration. First, this started off with them traveling more around Africa, trying to get to India, and this would lead to Spain, their rival, and this is Spain right here, as they would go with Columbus to the New World. So Portugal, very important for taking many Islamic advances like the astrolabe, learning about the winds, and embarking on an air exploration around Africa, all the way to India with people like Vasco da Gama, Bartholomew Diaz, and Prince Henry the Navigator, who really started these explorations. And let's get to our next word, our next person, who is Prince Henry, or Prince Henry the Navigator. Prince Henry the Navigator started a navigational school in Portugal where he took like the best map makers, the best ship designs that existed, and brought them together with the plan of exploration, which led to exploration around Africa, led to exploration all the way to India, if we look at explorers like Diaz and Vasco da Gama. Now, he established this school to bring exploration, to go to new lands and riches, and also to spread Catholic Christianity to many parts of the world. He was very much in the same mindset of a crusader who wanted to see a stop of Islam. Remember, at this time, Portugal and Spain had just defeated the Muslims who were in Portugal and Spain in the Reconquista. And they were able to take back their land and kick out the Muslims who were living there. And they get this exploration with his school. He funds it. He's not necessarily a sailor himself, but he funds people to start these explorations using many of the technologies like the astrolabe, map making from both Islamic sources and Jewish sources in his school, and advance Portugal, which leads to many riches for Portugal, which then leads other places like Spain, Europe, and France to begin their age of exploration, which will enrich Europe in the early modern era. Bartholomew Diaz is our next person. Bartholomew Diaz is a person who sailed under Prince Henry the Navigator and Portugal and was able to sail all the way around the Cape of Good Hope and was able to get around Africa. He wanted to keep going to India, but his crew said no, so they had to turn around. However, very important, because what he was able to do was give information about Africa, let everybody know that you're able to go around Africa in Europe, bring that back to Portugal, which will lead to future explorations, especially by Vasco da Gama, who does get all the way to India. Significant for getting around Africa, letting them know there was future exploration that Portugal would happen, which would allow Portugal to get into the Indian Ocean trade route, and also the trade route with Africa as well. Here we see Vasco da Gama, again sailing for Portugal, from Lisbon, Portugal, going from Prince Henry the Navigator's school, traveling all the way around Africa, went further than Diaz, and all the way to India, making many stops, and we see our Swahili city-states right here. And this opened up the Indian Ocean trade for Portugal. And when Portugal gets involved in the Indian Ocean trade, they will start taking over port cities and will try to control more of the trade, and will make monopolies on many of these cities as they come in. They kind of act like pirates. They basically come in, take over these cities, charge tariffs, and charge people to trade as they come into the Indian Ocean trade route from Portugal and Europe. And Portugal will become a dominant player in the Indian Ocean trade route. They'll never be able to control the trade completely. They're too small. They're not powerful enough for that. But they will control several cities on the route and will shut down some trade and will cause tariffs and will cause some taxes as they come into the trade route. And they bring many riches to Portugal, advancing Portugal, allowing Portugal to become a rich player for a while in the world. Spain will then advance after that with England and France, and allowing Europe to gain much more power in the early modern era. Trading post empire. This is a pretty good map here. that shows the power that Portugal had with their traveling. Everything in green pretty much on here are areas where Portugal built their trading post empire. Now, while they were able to take over some lands like Brazil and Angola and Mozambique, when we got into the Indian Ocean trade route, Portugal wasn't so much into taking over huge, large areas of land. They were more taking over cities where they would take over and establish their trade routes, put tariffs on them, and basically charge people taxes to do trading. So they came in kind of with their firepower, with their technology, and they were able to take over many of these cities and control a lot of the spice trade that was going on, that was very rich from this part of Southeast Asia in the Indian Ocean trade. Spices were incredibly valuable at this time. Remember, it's before refrigeration, so they can preserve foods, give more taste, more luxury goods. So spices were the big trade item in the early modern era, kind of like silk would be in the post-classical era, and like oil is today. Now, also they were able to take control of the slave trade that was going on here in Western Africa, moving many of these slaves to their areas in Brazil and also in areas of the Caribbean and the Americas. This was the trading post empire that Portugal was able to build and gain power in the early modern era. Christopher Columbus, one of the most controversial people in world history. Christopher Columbus was an Italian sailor who wanted to get rich like many Europeans in this age of exploration. And Christopher Columbus wanted to go around the Muslim traders that were dominating places like in the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire, as we will talk about, is located right here, and they were able to dominate a lot of the trade going back and forth from Europe into the spice trade, which was located here, and other goods from China and Asia. Here's Spain. Christopher Columbus was from Italy. He came here, and he wanted to get to this area, and he thought the best way to do it was to go from Spain, was to travel west to get east. Now, many of the people knew the world was round at this time. Columbus, using some maps from Marco Polo, thought that the world was a lot smaller than it was. So when he was here, he thought he was all the way in Southeast Asia off the islands. And he sailed west with the intent of getting there, going around the world. But again, his main miscalculation was he thought the world was a lot smaller than it was because he was using some faulty knowledge. Now, when he got there, though, Columbus changes world history because Columbus really connects the Americas, which the Europeans consider the New World, with the Old World, which will lead us to our Columbian Exchange in the next chapter. It will also lead to European diseases coming with on future explorations, the Spanish putting the native indigenous population into slavery as many of them die of diseases, 50 to 90%, which later leads to African slavery as well. Columbus's goal was to get rich. He wanted to get as much money as he could. If it was at the cost of the natives, there's really little evidence that he cared that much about their lives if you look at his actual readings. He was fine to put them in slavery to get gold, as many other Spanish conquistadores followed him and came into the Americas, which led to the fall later of the Aztec Empire, the Indian Empire. And one really sad thing is of these people, indigenous native people like the Taino, who he met in the Caribbean, they were almost driven to extinction as they were later replaced with African slaves. That's a reason why we see many people of Haiti and Jamaica. We think of them, and yeah, they have fairly dark skin. If we put that on a tone of darkness to lightness of skin, it's because they are ancestors of Africans. They were brought as slaves after Columbus. Columbus is significant because Columbus's journey really begins the Columbian Exchange, which we'll talk about more. It begins a genocide of native people in the Americas, of diseases, being put in slavery by Europeans as they take over. It also begins a African diaspora as Africans are brought as slaves over to the New World. So Columbus, his significance cannot be denied. He was a very significant person. Was he a good sailor? Yeah, he was a pretty good sailor. He made some faulty errors in his map making. He was brave, but he had views of his time as a European Christian, believing that Europeans needed to spread their culture and their traditions over the beliefs of others and did not want to understand the native culture, which was how many Europeans felt at this time. Today, we definitely put that as racist and, genocidal and what happened to the native population in Africa. That is Christopher Columbus. Sorry, but you need to say a lot about him because he has a huge impact in history, whether you're one of the few people who admire him and respect him or one of the, in my opinion, many people who do not respect him, but we cannot deny that he was hugely significant in world history. I'm going to quickly go over Marco Polo. Marco Polo, we know a lot about. Marco Polo was an explorer from Venice who went and then went to China on his exploration, and he went along the Silk Road. And he went and got to know Kublai Khan and had a gold tablet and was able to explore all around China and brought stories back to Europe. Well, one of the person who read these stories later in his life was Christopher Columbus. And Christopher Columbus, reading Marco Polo, really wanted to find a way to get to China, to get to Southeast Asia, and to get into the spice trade and the riches that were there. And he used some maps and ideas from Marco Polo which influenced his trip in the early modern era. Ptolemy was a Greek mapmaker. He was also a mathematician and astronomer. Ptolemy is significant because after the Crusades, many of his ideas are brought back to Europe, where people like Spain and Portugal start using them for exploration. One person who was influenced by his exploration was Christopher Columbus, who used his maps and some of Marco Polo's description to get the distance he thought it was to get to America. Now, Columbus made mistakes on this and thought the world was a lot smaller than it was, but he was influenced by Ptolemy's calculations, which again were from Greece in the Classical era, carried on by the Muslims in the post-Classical era, and then came to Christopher Columbus in the early modern era. Now let's get to Ferdinand and Isabella on our next sheet of paper. Ferdinand and Isabella of newly united Spain. So Ferdinand and Isabella, they married. And when they married, they united Castilla and Aragon into a united Spain. It was not one country before. Now remember, we have Granada down here, which is Islamic. So the Spanish are defeating the Muslims. They're pushing them back out of Spain in what's called the Reconquista or the Reconquest. And they're pushing them back into basically northern Africa. Then there's this marriage which unites these two different kingdoms and they become one united Spain. Also, which is very significant, is that with them becoming one united Spain, Christopher Columbus later goes to them and sells his idea of going west to get to the east or Asia. And they finance Christopher Columbus with 3 ships, the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria. And they give him a crew with a lot of criminals, people who are in debt. And basically they let him do it because if he crashes out in the sea and doesn't make it, they didn't spend a lot of money on it. It wasn't a huge investment. But they invest in Columbus, which pays off big as he comes back with goods from the Americas. And this leads them to make many more trips to the Americas and gain a whole lot of wealth, gold, and Spanish silver. We'll talk about the peso de hecho, which makes Spain a major power in the early modern era. I'm going to throw out another word for you guys to write down. You can see it right here. It's called Reconquista. Reconquista. Write that one down somewhere on a piece of paper. This will be an extra bonus word. If you get it, it's going to be worth 3 points if it shows up on our vocab test. The Reconquista is basically when Spain, Christians in Spain, were able to retake or take Muslim lands from Spain and make Spain a Christian nation instead of a Muslim nation. It was going on basically the same times as the Crusades. This was kind of like the Spain's own little crusade, where they pushed out the Muslim population and were able to take it back for Christianity, which will be big because Spain will then become a major explorer using many Muslim technologies in the early modern era and will grow rich using Muslim technologies as a Christian nation.